Okay, I'm happy to admit it. I was wrong about the story in the engine, and here's why. So, I watched this episode at 8 o'clock in the morning when it first released on iPlayer, and I wasn't too impressed by the story. I don't know, it just felt a little bit underwhelming, to be honest. It felt like there wasn't very much action. It felt like there was a lot of people just standing around talking for most majority of the episode. But then on rewatch, I actually realised that this is kind of part of the story. The whole reason they're standing about talking is because they need to stand about talking. There's not very much place for them to move around in a barbershop. And once I finally tuned out of that, I kind of tuned into what they were actually saying within this episode. And a lot of the dialogue is actually so poetic, it's beautiful. There's so many good lines within this episode that you wouldn't see in a normal Doctor Who episode. You wouldn't really hear that kind of dialogue because a lot of it's kind of fast paced and quick decisions and stuff like that. And with this episode, it's kind of just like a character deep dive, really. That's kind of what the episode is. You're diving into Belinda's character, you're diving into the Doctor's character, you're diving into the barber's character and who he is. And in a way, the episode's kind of a slower paced episode, but it's done in a deliberate manner. I went into this episode expecting big spiders and fights with big spiders and all that kind of stuff because of the trailer, and it wasn't that initially, and I think that's what kind of let me down. But then realising that the episode was called The Story and the Engine, and putting two together with them telling stories in order to operate the engine, it kind of is just genius, to be honest. It's such a beautiful story. And then I did mention that there was parts of this story that were in the trailer that were missing, and I take that back because actually on rewatch I did see the parts that I said were missing. So the spider in the episode actually does blow up in the episode. It's not missing from the episode, it's just I didn't see it. But what I need to remember is when I'm doing these reviews, a lot of the time I'm focused on character development and the back scoring of the music and all that kind of stuff, and my face most of the time is on a notepad writing down stuff that my head most of the time is jotting back and forth from my notepad while I'm writing stuff down while I'm watching the episode. So I do miss some things within the episodes, and I think with this one I just missed the entire plot, to be honest with you. I just missed the entire point of the episode because there's so much great things in this episode. Like, it literally is probably one of the Doctor Who episodes that feels more Doctor Who-y. Not only that, I also called this episode typical Doctor Who filler, which I was also wrong about because there's so much in this episode that is actually helping set up towards the finale, which means that not really any episode, coming to think about it, in this season has been complete filler episode. Every single episode has had a purpose. Like, going back to Lucky Day, there is a reason that we revisited Ruby's story, and that's because she's going to become more important in the finale. So they need to set that up so that it doesn't just feel like Ruby's popping up out of nowhere. And in this story, they delved into like gods in a totally different way, and the barber's not a god, and he was like kind of working for the gods, but because he was human and now he's not human and he kind of has no place to fit in, and there's just so much complexity within this story that it probably would need about 20 rewatches in order to fully understand what's going on. But also within this episode we have pop-ups from Captain Poppy, who was in the very first episode of season 1 in Space Babies. So you're just like, right, okay, how does all these seams and strings connect together? And I feel like the story in the engine does a really good job of that, because it shows you like spider webs and gives you ideas of how stories work behind the scenes and how they connect all the dots and all that kind of stuff. And it's brilliant. It's a really, really good episode, to be honest. There's also the Mrs. Flood appearance, which I still feel was a little bit forced, just because they said that she was going to be in every single episode, and it felt like she was just kind of shoved in here. But it does hold a little bit more significance than that as well. If the Doctor was telling the story of Belinda, he would never have known that Mrs. Flood was there. So how did Mrs. Flood end up within that story? And this shows up a little bit more. This gives us a little bit more information, although not obvious, but it gives us a little bit more information on Mrs. Flood. It's as if she is inserting herself into stories from the Doctor. It's as if she's just putting herself everywhere that she possibly can, and it's not for the lack of the Doctor still not noticing her, because that's a little bit weird. But then looking at the episode in a second run, the Doctor never actually looks at the screens when he's telling his story about Belinda, so he wouldn't have seen Mrs. Flood on that screen. But how she ended up there and how the Doctor knew she was there is a mystery to me, because he would never have known that she was there unless he's seen her doing all of this, like the walking round about, and he's seen Mrs. Flood, which would make no sense because he would notice Mrs. Flood from being Ruby's next door neighbour, because he actually had a conversation with Mrs. Flood on that very first episode. So yeah, it's as if Mrs. Flood's inserting herself into these stories rather than anything else. So I think that actually holds more significance than her just being put there because she needs to be there. It just feels at this point as if she's just showing up all the time, and it's kind of getting a little boring now, because we were promised answers. We were promised that her story arc would slowly start to reveal itself through this season, and we're 5 episodes in and still no one has a clue who the hell Mrs. Flood is. One of the things that really helped set this episode up a little bit better was, before I watched it for the second time, I did go and read the prequel story on the BBC website, and if you haven't read that, I do suggest that you give it a read, because it actually was really good. It really helps set up Omo's story and helps you kind of engage with Omo a little bit more than you did before you watched the episode, because as it says in my first review, Omo did just feel like a little bit of a random character that was just thrown in there. But reading the prequel story really allowed you to kind of engage with Omo a little bit more and kind of feel a little bit more empathetic towards his character and understand why he did the things he was doing and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it really is worth a read if you haven't read the prequel story. I do think that this episode is actually going to play quite a big part into the finale. Not a big massive part, but it definitely holds some storytelling aspects that will help us understand the finale a little bit more, and I feel like the finale is just going to kind of twist our brains in ways that we just probably won't see coming. And I don't know, the pop-up of Joe Martin's Doctor makes me think that they want to continue Joe Martin's Doctor, and I'm just like, what is the possibilities of them potentially ending this season with Ncuti's Doctor and jumping back in the next season to have Joe Martin as the Doctor to tell her story and then regenerate into other incarnations that we've not yet seen? Like, is that possible? Like, is it entirely possible for Russell to just be like, okay, you're not, like, Ncuti's not going to regenerate into this Doctor, but he is going to fly away in the TARDIS and we're going to stay with Joe Martin's Doctor? Because that's what they've done in the 60th anniversary in the Giggle. Essentially, David Tennant handed over his role to Ncuti, but David Tennant left the show and left Ncuti in charge. So could we see that happening again with these two characters? Could Joe Martin potentially become the next Doctor? I mean, a little bit of food for thought there. But yeah, this video's running on a little longer than I expected it to. But yeah, basically I wanted to just kind of change my rating for this episode, because I don't feel like a 6.5 was very fair, because it is a really good episode. Although there's still some of my points that I'd originally said that I agree with, like the pacing and stuff was still a little bit slow. I want to give this episode a 7.5 because I feel like it was a lot better than I first said it was, and it's still one of the lower episodes of the season, but it's definitely a rewatchable episode. I would say that much. If you didn't like it on the first watch, try rewatching it. You might understand it a little bit better, because I certainly did.